The next federal election date is less than a year and a half away, and leading up to it, researchers are taking a look at Canada's information ecosystem, where that system is vulnerable, what the threats look like, and how Canadians engage with media and with politicians. Aengus Bridgman is director of the Media Ecosystem Observatory, helping to lead this effort. He's also an assistant professor at McGill University's Max Bell School of Public Policy. Aengus, good to see you.
Lovely to see you as well.
I want to start with, what exactly are you measuring in this project, and what is the ultimate goal here?
What we set out to do was to try to provide the sort of first ever view of an information ecosystem. And what we mean by that is the sum total of the complex relationships between politicians, journalists, news outlets, and influencers in the Canadian context that go about forming people's attitudes and opinions. So we set out to do that. So we've been collecting social media and survey data across 5 of the largest social media platforms used by Canadians. And this report, this is the first one that's coming out, is an attempt to sort of synthesize all that data together and say very clearly, this is the state of the Canadian information ecosystem, this is its health. And yeah, as you said, here are some vulnerabilities, threats, and things to watch out for.
Okay, so let's talk about your first situation report, which is for May 2024. And you say influence across those platforms is concentrated in a small number of voices. What does that look like?
Yeah, so in a democracy, you kind of want some people to be able to be louder than others. You want your politicians, your elected representatives to be able to influence the conversation. But you also want some degree of equality. You want Canadians to be able to contribute to the conversation and participate and influence. And what we found is in the Canadian conversation, and particularly amongst Canadian media, it's extremely unequal. So you've got some statistics there. So 65% of engagement with news outlets is with just 5 outlets in online spaces. We track about 900 in Canada. So that's 5 are taking up almost all the space. And very few of those are local outlets, of course. They're primarily sort of the large national ones. So that's kind of on the media side. And sort of more generally, there are some very prominent influencers, very important politicians who are able to sort of command attention and shape the conversation in a way that is very disproportionate to sort of the overall number of voices in the system. So this is something to track over time. If you start to see sort of that influence becoming more and more concentrated, you might be worried about having enough voices as part of the conversation. So this is one of the measures that we're tracking.
And that certainly ties into the question of trust. We often hear a lot about that in terms of media and information. So what have you found in terms of who Canadians are actually putting their trust into these days?
This is quite a depressing picture in some ways. We started doing this research back in 2019 under a different guise, and what we found is that there was sort of a core set of very trusted Canadian news outlets. We've seen an erosion in that over the last 5 years. So now we sort of look at the key information providers, so the people who are providing us with the political, cultural information that we need to sort of understand what's going on in the world and to make kind of informed decisions. What we find is generally quite low trust, particularly for politicians and for big tech companies who are in many ways some of the most important actors. Big tech companies make decisions that shape the way we consume information. And for example, Meta's decision to block news on their platforms, that's reflected in this very low trust number where Canadians can't trust them to act in their best interests. And even journalists and media organizations are being less and less trusted these days.
Yeah, and we saw that number for elected officials, 32%. You did take a wider look at where politicians fit into this information ecosystem, and you say that it's conservative voices that are dominating the online conversation. So tell me more about that element.
So we looked at all federal and provincial politicians across Canada, and we sort of calculated the number of posts that they have, the overall engagement, and their influence. And the influence we sort of measure by their ability to shape the conversation. And what we find is today, or in May of this year, the conservative voices are very dominant. So what we see is between 60 and 65% of engagement in online spaces is with those from that party family. That includes, of course, the leader of the federal Conservative Party, but also premiers and other elected officials. It's much lower for the other political parties. So what we see is sort of a real imbalance in the ecosystem. That is to say, one party is taking up a lot of the oxygen and is able to shape the conversation in a big way. And as you say, kind of a year and a half into the election, that's going to be something that some of the other parties are going to be trying to shift away from.
Okay, we have a moment left, so I want to shift from the vulnerabilities to the threats coming from outside that information ecosystem. And two that you look at are misinformation and foreign influence, which is obviously a big topic of conversation in Canadian politics right now. What do the numbers say on those two items?
What we see is misinformation. I'll start with misinformation. We looked at a variety of measures, sort of trying to understand the extent to which Canadians are concerned about this, the extent to which this misinformation, foreign interference, et cetera, were part of the conversation. We find a very high degree of concern amongst Canadians, and to a certain extent it's appropriate. While we see a relatively small percentage of sort of links out to misinformation websites on social media, they actually garner a huge amount of the engagement. So I think the estimate is about 17.5% of all engagement with link-based posts is to known misinformation websites. And so that shows that misinformation is prominent in our information ecosystem. And this is a number, again, we're going to be tracking month over month. And if it starts to get worse, this is something that we're going to really need to take notice of. In terms of the foreign influence, again, got that high concern. And one of the things we do is we don't just track Canadian entities, we also track a set of international entities coming from a variety of countries, and we try to understand the extent to which they influence the Canadian information ecosystem. That is to say, if they start talking about something prior to the Canadians starting to talk about something, and then Canadian news starts to pick it up, or Canadian politicians start to pick it up, we can develop sort of a very precise measure of what that number is. And so what we see, for example, is India and China exert a higher influence at the current moment in May than Russia. So we'll be able to track that again month over month and sort of see the extent to which there is overt influence. Now, of course, this doesn't cover the wide range of foreign influence activities that are currently sort of winding their way through various committees and commissions, but it gives us some unique and new insight into the extent to which those countries can influence the Canadian conversation.
Right. Well, we'll certainly be watching the data and how it evolves over the next several months as we head towards that next federal campaign. Aengus Bridgman, thank you for this.
My pleasure.